Why is the first giant fight about the debt ceiling? I thought we're done with fiddling around the edges on fiscal stuff. Why is this the first major place where this coalition government is actually going to be tested?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question if you're coming from the standpoint of the new right? And that is, but I would reject the notion that we don't actually care about spending, because I look at spending as what fuels big government and the bureaucracy. And I don't think there's enough conservatives in the world to be able to make sure that the bureaucracies are staffed out with America First people. And I look at the bureaucracies from what I saw, and it's not the Department of Education, it's the Department of Critical Race Theory. And you go grant by grant, and you realize we're funding cultural Marxists to be our teachers, to turn our kids into more cultural Marxists. And we saw what that looks like in 2020 when they're burning our cities down and tearing our monuments down. So heading into this, towards the end of this last year, we put out a budget. And the central thing about this budget that I was preoccupied with is how do you take the fiscal crisis that I do believe exists, largely unsexy to the new right world and the America First perspective, but it does exist. And how do you ensure that that is going to deal at the same time of what I would think is the number one issue for a statesman right now, which is this woke and weaponized regime, and to fuse those indelibly so that you are saving money while you are defunding the Department of Critical Race Theory. And you are going after the regime through the purse strings and using the leverage point. Why the debt limit? It's the leverage point that we have in front of us. And you've got to be able to use the opportunities that are in front of you to be able to serve your interests accordingly. And so if you were to say, we're going to have a nationwide conversation for the next year and we're not going to talk about woke and weaponized bureaucracy, that would be a missed opportunity, a massive missed opportunity. And I'm a little worried about it, to be honest with you. You know, you hear the messaging of Kevin McCarthy and others, and they're talking just about negotiations and, you know, artificial levels of debt, right? That concerns me, and I'm pushing on that. But at the same time, the terms of what they have passed out of the House are serving our interest to go after a bureaucracy that would make any of us go away if they could do it at scale.
So let's get granular here. What exactly is this quote unquote debt ceiling fight? What is the procedural reality of what's about to happen, and why is it this opportunity to do stuff along the lines of what you talked about here?
It is fundamentally an effort to cut the spending of agencies that people have dealings with, right? So we got it away from Social Security and Medicare, which is where all the budget eggheads wanted it to be. And we focused it squarely on the annual appropriations process that is used to fund the bureaucracy. And we set it at a level. It's pre-COVID levels, but if you protect certain things like veterans and Homeland Security, you know, the border version, you're going to be at 20% cut to where we are last year. And most agencies are looking at 30% cut. So think about that: Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services.
Did agencies really get a 30% budget increase during the COVID years?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So and some of it is a larger amount because you're having to go deeper when you are protecting some places, but that is going to require significant trade-offs to be able to go after where I think are the most weaponized parts. And it's, you know, EPA. It's they put a 77-year-old Navy veteran in jail for 18 months for building 4 ponds on his land to fight wildfires. So people want to be for clean energy, clean environment. I want to be for a clean environment. That's not what you're getting when you fund EPA. They're all Marxist. They're all militant, and we've got to defund them. And by putting this level of spending that's set so low and then capping it, we have the ability to crush the bureaucracy through the funding. And then it goes after some other things like the IRS expansion and things like that. So I think it's a major opportunity, and I hope they continue to hold strong.
Walk me through the ticky-tacky of what exactly the procedural questions at play here are. Like, what is the debt ceiling, and how does that create this opportunity to do stuff, and what's the timeline?
The timeline, so they say, is June 1st.
And what happens on June 1st?
So unlike the end of a fiscal year where you have appropriations that sunset and you can't fund certain portions of the government that are not on autopilot, in a debt limit situation, you have the need to be able to take on new debt because you have a deficit. And you are up against a statutory limitation on your ability to do that. Now, government doesn't shut down because revenues are still coming in. And so you can use those revenues accordingly. And so, but we do face the prospect of default, however you define it. I define it as payment of Treasury's principal and interest. They define it as the payment on time of every obligation the federal government has ever made. And therein lies the debate. But that X date, that moment of the inability to be able to move forward without a higher debt limit is what this is, the timing of this all. And Janet Yellen said it will be June 1st. She added some wiggle room and said, I'm not sure that's exactly where it is. And I would say it is certainly not June 1st. But she's playing politics because the gnomes at the Treasury Department are scared out of their mind because they don't want to have to choose between what gets paid in a triage. They don't, in that sense, don't want to be politicians. They want the gravy train to keep going on, and they want basically a massive get out of jail free card from a fiscal standpoint. So this will play out over the between now and June and potentially into mid-June. And at the end of the day, like I said, Joe Biden, Secretary Yellen have the ability to make sure that revenues that coming in is more than enough to pay for that Treasury principal and interest and make sure we don't have an actual default. And then we can debate as a broke country what's getting paid on what time frame. And I would argue I want to have a debate about, a couple of millions of dollars that NIH is spending on gain of function research. That's the debate that I want to have with the country. I want to debate the extent to which HUD is being used to break up single family neighborhoods. That's a debate I want to have. And we will be able to do that over the summer.
I want to add that unfortunately too many Republicans and so-called budget hawks have bought into this narrative that, June 1st, the world falls apart. The default is a real threat. And it's led us to a place where we have not had the debate that Russ is bringing up here. And I'd just like to, again, kind of going back in time, you had a lot of Republicans and conservative and even libertarian budget hawks that started to say around 2015, 2016, we shouldn't even be talking about discretionary spending. It's only mandatory spending, particularly focused on entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. They didn't want to talk about, the Department of CRT. They didn't want to talk about HUD. They wanted just to narrowly focus it on these core entitlement programs that are very popular, that, there has not been a ability to actually move any reforms to them. So they wanted to keep running the same old spending playbook where they start the debate off by saying we need to focus only on Social Security and Medicare. They lose the fight before it even began, and you'd still get this march of increasing debt, a growth of a woke and weaponized bureaucracy, and further threats to our financial future. And what they revealed themselves as is fundamentally not serious about reforming our country's budget, significantly cutting spending, or recognizing the political reality and the actual opportunities at play.
So I want to delve a little bit more into that difference between old guard budget hawks versus the strategy that you guys are proposing, because again, showing my cards here, I find those old guard budget hawks to be extremely annoying and politically dangerous, right? Like, you're going to get ads of grandma getting thrown off a building all the live long day if the core message of the Republican Party and the conservative movement is we want to cut Social Security and Medicare. Putting aside the fact that Social Security is actually a pretty well-designed program in terms of dollars in, dollars out. Medicare is much less so. What is the argument between you guys and the old guard budget hawks on how we get back to fiscal sanity and how we should prioritize where cuts are made?
So we have failed as a budget community for 20 years. There hasn't been a massive, we had some wins, during the Obama years, but they were thrown over the board for some political reasons we can get into. But we haven't had a big budget agreement since 1997. So there's a long track record of futility. And my assessment of that futility, for the reasons for it, is because of a focus on Social Security and Medicare. So if you didn't wake up in the morning and focus on Social Security, Medicare, and you couldn't go to sleep with your head held high as a budget community. And what has that gotten you? It has gotten you, put aside the merits of the two programs and their unsustainability. What's that gotten you? It's gotten total failure. So it has also been part and parcel of a distraction away from the spending that is most dangerous to our community, which I believe is the bureaucracy. So I could put on this table what I think are the most sustainable reforms to Medicare. And I won't, even if it had a magic wand, it became law, tomorrow we wouldn't be any more free. We would have the same bureaucracy that we're funding every year. You don't, by the way, Congress doesn't have an annual vote on it. They have an annual vote on appropriations. So they're focusing on what they don't have a vote on to the exclusion of the more damaging stuff they do have a vote on. And the budget community says, oh, this is great. You know, at some point, the bondholders are going to force everyone into the room and we'll have Social Security cuts. And I just think it's a whole game that has failed. And we now have the woke culture that we see that's been funded by the federal government. It has been a funder, not just a conveyor belt of it. And we're responsible for that. And you look at the budget community and you're like, well, why do you care so much about Social Security and Medicare? I understand the insolvency issues. I'm not denying it. Okay, why do you care? And then you look at their bios on Twitter and they got the Ukraine flag and they've got the rainbow. Yeah. And you really come to the realization that they don't think it's 1159 in this country. They think it's the same old country. This is Ronald Reagan's country. This is the 1960s. Like there's no urgency. They don't see the cultural things that we do of the problems in our country and say there's anything wrong with that, you know? And that I think is the tell for why they have devised a strategy that is ultimately futile from their own perspective, but avoids things that they kind of like. They kind of like the CRT movement. They kind of like the fact that we have this structure where any conversation about appropriations must mean there'll be less money for defense, which is another reason why you should like it as well. There'd be potentially less money for defense, and that might mean we don't have the same ability to fight in Ukraine that would cause us to be able to confront China, which is more of our interest. So you get to see the kind of shell games that go on within the cartel when these kinds of strategic trade-offs are made. And then I'll just go back to one thing you asked about earlier, and that is why the debt limit. The cartel is a reality that exists. And because it takes all of the legislating off the floor, it only preserves certain must-pass bills that if you don't use them, you're not going to do anything on the floor of the House and the Senate. So we can have a debate about, does the debt limit be used for this or versus something else? That's fine. But the notion that you're going to fight on appropes and you're going to fight on debt limit and you're going to fight on the defense authorization bills, that if you don't fight on those, you're not fighting on anything.